Today on Lightning Bugs. If I go to talk to, say, Congress about art spending, I'll always get comments from the peanut gallery like, why don't you go talk about something important? Why don't you go talk about something that puts food on the table? And because of that attitude, I felt like I would like to spend a year pointing out that, our ancestors wouldn't have gotten from the middle of the food chain to the top of the food chain without ideas, without creativity. But you two stuck out because after my conversations with both of you, I felt like there was suddenly an imperative in the equation for me. Not just that, it's important that we're creative, but that the survival of people on the planet actually might come down to how we communicate and get on the same page about how to set the course correctly. Hi, if you're enjoying listening to Lightning Bugs, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. It helps a lot. Hello, fellas. How's it going?
Hello.
So let me do all the official stuff first. You're listening to Lightning Bugs, conversations about creativity with me, Ben Folds. My two guests today are repeat offenders here on the show. And I'll read their bios for you. Really, neither one of them, the bios don't cover it, but we'll go there anyway. First of all, Dr. Roger Payne. Dr. Roger Payne, I see him down there, but you'll see him otherwhere. Dr. Roger Payne was born in the USA. Is best known for discovering that humpback whales sing songs and that the calls of fin and blue whales evolved to be heard across oceans. He is now retired from Ocean Alliance, which he founded and spent 50 plus years in doing research and working for whale conservation. He has led over 100 expeditions to all oceans, studied every species of large whale in the wild, and started the longest continuous study of known individual whales, southern rights. It is now in its 53rd year. Together with his students, many now leaders in whale research, he pioneered several of the benign research techniques now used across the world to study the behavior of free-swimming whales. He has published books and papers on his many honors and his many. Sorry, I'm a musician, so I'm going to just get through this. I might have to sing it to get through. He pioneered several benign research techniques now used across the world to study the behavior of free-swimming whales. He has published books and papers, and his many honors and awards include a MacArthur Fellowship, a UNEP, Global 500 Award, a knighthood in the Netherlands, and Oxford University's Dawkins Prize. That's a lot of stuff, and there's way more than this. Now let's move over to Jonathan Gottschall.
Could you do my biography first, so I don't have to follow that act?
I know. Yeah, he was your opening act there, Jonathan.
Yeah.
And Jonathan says he wrote this. Jonathan does neat stuff. I don't know. Actually, no, his mom wrote that. Okay. Jonathan Gottschall, appraised by Steven Pinker as our deepest thinker about the powerful role of stories in our lives. Jonathan Gottschall is a distinguished fellow in the English department at Washington and Jefferson College. His writing at the intersection of science and art has been covered in depth by the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, Scientific American, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Oprah Magazine, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Science, Nature, and on shows like Radiolab, Morning Edition, National Geographic, Star Talk with Neil deGrasse. Is it deGrasse?
DeGrasse.
Sorry, I've only read that. I haven't listened to. And the Joe Rogan Experience. That's Rogan or Rogan?
Rogan.
Sorry. Jonathan is the author or editor of 8 books, including The Storytelling Animal, How Stories Make Us Human. I loved that one. The Professor in the Cage, Why Men Fight and Why We Like to Watch. The Story Paradox, How Our Love of Storytelling Builds Societies and Tears Them Down. And that's his newest book, and you should You should get that. I think it's an important book. So now that I've introduced these two fellas, this is my last, at least for a while. I'm going on hiatus, so this completes 1 year of my podcast, and I started this thing really trying to do my small part in elevating the value or the perceived value of creativity and ideas. And the reason I thought that was important and interesting to me is because I constantly go to bat for arts education. And I find that in the real world, in company of grown-ups, and it's like politicians, creativity, no matter what they seem to say, by their actions and the way people seem to view creativity it's art made by silly little people at the margins that wear weird clothes for our amusement. And if I go to talk to, say, Congress about art spending, I'll always get comments from the peanut gallery like, why don't you go talk about something important? Why don't you go talk about something that puts food on the table? And because of that attitude, I felt like I would like to spend a year pointing out that, our ancestors wouldn't have gotten from the middle of the food chain to the top of the food chain without ideas, without creativity. And there's no better place to study creativity than in the place where that's all we do is in the arts. I talked to a lot of different, I talked to scientists, authors, dancers, musicians, politicians about it, and I learned a lot. But you two stuck out because after my conversations with both of you, I felt like there was suddenly an imperative in the equation for me. Not just that, it's important that we're creative, but that the survival of people on the planet actually might come down to how we communicate and get on the same page about how to set the course correctly. And your two angles are you come from different places. Jonathan, your life has been spent, a lot of it, I don't know what you did with the rest of your time, but a lot of it has been spent studying stories, narratology, what makes a good story and what makes a bad story. And I think that's very important. And your new book is, kids, you should definitely get The Story Paradox. I don't think there's much more important thing to talk about now than our colliding narratives and how that's destroying us. Jonathan, we're talking to someone who is really one of the few artists out there who has made something that has actually moved artistically in our lifetimes, moved the meter. Roger's album, Songs of the Humpback Whales, really people sprung into action based on that album. There seems to be a way for art to communicate creativity, the arts, to communicate important stuff that we need to. I don't believe we've cracked the code in this era on doing that. I believe artists in general are fairly muted. And there's probably really good reasons for that, which we can get into. But before we get there, I want to talk to Roger about the experience of that album, and don't be too humble, what the album actually probably accomplished.
Well, let me just say, you, in introducing us both, you got onto the subject of Jonathan's books. And I must say, whoever's listening, just get the latest one, which is called The Story Paradox. I've read it. I won't make a penny whether you do or not, but I can tell you that it will make a better world. It's headed that way. I'm a scientist. I've spent my whole life in science, and yet I think I value the arts more than I do. I think, put it this way, that what science contributes is enormously important, but what the arts now can take from that is, in fact, the ultimate importance. Because people in science, you spend your imagination and you do all kinds of things, which if you speak out incorrectly, that's it, you're over. Whereas in the arts, everything is imagination. And I think that the ability to communicate with the world is vastly better developed in artists than it is with scientists, obviously. And that's why I see art as so insanely important. And I think that Jonathan has expressed that in a way so excellent and
Me too.
direct that I just wildly recommend it. But I'll start by saying the whale record that I borrowed some sounds from a friend who I had just met in Bermuda, and we put out a record of that plus some recordings that I had then later made of humpback whales, and it went viral for those times. It still supposedly has been heard more than any other record of wildlife sounds. And I think somehow it speaks to the human being in ways that are just phenomenally strong. And I don't understand it. A lot of people weep when they hear these sounds for the first time. That wasn't the effect it had on me. It just blew my mind, however, in terms of, I thought immediately it was apparent, this is how you do what a friend of mine used to refer to as get the listening. This is how you actually get the attention of the world. And so when I put them out, there was lots of pressure. They should have some explanation overnight. And I said, no. And there were suggestions of they should be accompanied by musicians. And I said, no.
Please,
Give
God.
the whales a chance to speak. But the hardest one of all was Ben, you can do it, the musicians part. But in the beginning, I thought, I wanted whales to have the stage and nobody else to interfere. And so there is on one side of the recording, the original recording, which was so old and so long ago that it was in fact an LP record. And there's one side, a 45-minute cut, and you just listen to these whales. And when you put headphones on somebody and you set them down comfortably and you play these sounds, the reaction you get is absolutely profound. At first, if there's several people and you have headphones on several, they will chatter back and forth for just a moment. Wow, whoa, this kind of comment. And then they calm down. And eventually, after 10 or 15 minutes of listening or more, when they take off their headphones, they don't lift them off the way we normally do. They basically sort of just wipe them off their face. It's as though somebody's coming out of a trance. It's
amazing.
Extraordinary to see. It really is. And that's common. Absolutely common. And many people, as I said, weep when they hear them. And the result, I think, of these sounds and getting them out in a way that enabled the whales to be heard, it certainly kick-started the whale, the effort to save whales.
I'm positive that people sprung into action because of that record. I mean, I think that's observably true if you look back on it and think about what I think Greenpeace. I lost my mind. Greenpeace.
You're thinking of Sea Shepherd as well?
Yeah.
Greenpeace is certainly it. Greenpeace started as being something that was concerned with trying to put an end to the development and testing of nuclear weapons and switched to whales. And that was and that occurred after they heard whale songs.
Right.
And that was such an extraordinary shift that all kinds of other organizations started out and did wonderful things. And although I worked flat out for 2 years meeting all these people and giving talks and this kind of thing, it was in the end, it was just dead obvious that what people needed to hear was the whales, and have me set up that helped.
What, Roger, when people are responding so emotionally to whale song, what do you think is happening there? Are they feeling a sense of kinship with the animal?
I think that the acoustic part of the brain, which is being, I think, somehow affected by these whales, it's why I think it's a wonderful example of, if I said to you, Jonathan, tell me, what's so good about music? Why do you like music? Why do you care about music? And nobody can, I bet not even Ben can answer that in a full way. That
Yeah.
It does, in other words, our deep, deep love and affection, and the impact that music has, I think, is so old. I actually believe it's older than humanity, and that there have been all kinds of singing creatures probably before, and that basically the reason you can't give voice to why it is so important in any way that really explains it even to yourself is simply because it's so incredibly ancient. And I think these whales are hitting that, and I suspect because they've been around for 60 million years making these sounds, you can tell that by looking at their ears from old fossils and so on, that in fact they are probably vastly more experienced and skilled than we are, because we are so deeply visual and also use other senses so actively. But they do too. Everybody uses it. I mean, every species uses every sense it can possibly use, and uses it right to the limits of its ability. We hear, sounds that are, if they were any fainter, you would hear the random banging together of the molecules of whatever is near the microphone. And if you saw light more sensitively, you would see less than a photon, which is impossible. And you smell, and some animals smell things with such sensitivity they can detect a single molecule of the fragrance. So all sense organs drive right to the end of their sensitivity to be able to do it. Well, I think it's the same kind of thing, but in a world in which there's no voicing of what the hell's going on, no real understanding. It's all subconscious. And I think the whales have just nailed that market. That's my feeling.
Well, it is bizarre. The first time I ever heard whales, Emma and I were in Hawaii, and we just went underwater, and you could hear them just right there at the beach. And I have to say, two things about it that struck me as a musician. One was how familiar they sounded, and it wasn't from because I had the album, although that's some of it. There was a real familiarity that is really hard to explain when you hear them. It's a little bit like a barnyard or something. You're like, you don't hear it as an exotic creature. You hear it as it's my brother out there. It really feels related. And it also, there is something, I don't know if it's imagined, but there is something that seems wise and on purpose about it too. And, when you point out that whales' songs evolve, are passed around, and that they follow something akin to a sonata form, that's nuts. Like, that's really beyond anything that I could understand with my tiny mind.
Well, exactly, because whales have been completely separated from us in a way that would be the only thing you ever can hear is if you are in a place where they come very close to shore, and those are pretty rare places. And people didn't, I think, spend an awful lot of time in the water in many such places. So if you're looking for a way to compare what whales and we have been doing for all these years, you find that whales have been, I can't remember what the number is, but they've been about 200 times longer in the wild than we are believed to have been, our species, Homo sapiens. And so they're very familiar with what's going on there in the water. And you really get that feeling that they're doing subtle stuff that is deeply emotional.
Now, John, I think I'd take this over to you and how it relates to stories because, like as a songwriter, I see a compelling vocalist in the Whales, but then inside there, somehow, what Roger did with that album did amount to a story, and I can't really say how. Somehow, it implies a story. Maybe there's a villain involved. Maybe there's something that is involved that people sprung into action. Because what I'd love to come away with is this good story works. It puts people into action. We move. This is a story that mutes your involvement. The kind of story, and you talk about this in a couple of your books, about the kind of story that the effect is it makes you stay home. And so I want to look at why the humpback whale's story, or what part of that is a story, and why that's effective, and why I can't walk out on stage and say, all right, yeah, save the planet, everybody, come on, and not get shit thrown at me. Like there's his album worked, my version of that album would not work.
Yeah. I don't know. This is all kind of mysterious, of course. But I do think you hear the whale song. When I hear the whale song, and by the way, I've just started reading Roger's book about whales, and I just want to say also, to repay the compliment, I admire it greatly, and it filled me with admiration. It also filled my bitter little soul with envy. It's a great book. It's really beautifully written. So Roger is also narrating the story. He's also helping us contextualize this song, make sense of it. My first impression is when people, especially people who are completely naive to the natural science of whales and whale song, when they first hear this music, they feel a powerful sense of communion with a creature that they might have once thought of as a sort of, dumb fish, just swimming around the ocean. Who cares if you kill him? And suddenly you're dealing with what appears to be, I don't know if we're projecting or not, but what appears to be a creature of art. That is like us, and that has sort of depths and subtleties that it pays to understand. It just doesn't feel right to kill them anymore. And then you do have a whole architecture of storytelling breaking out. Where you have, I don't know, the victims might be the whales, the heroes might be the people like Roger fighting to save them, and the villains might be all of the people like us who are polluting the oceans with trash and noise, and also the whalers and that kind of thing.
Interesting. Yeah.
I wonder how this is, what we can learn from the success of that album when people go out and scream at the sky and microphones, make albums, T-shirts, movies, and everything they can about climate change, and it's not a hit. Why is that not a hit?
What I think is great about the Whale Song album, and what I hope that other activists might learn from it, is there is no explicit haranguing going on. I love that you didn't have any sort of foreword to it, any sort of notes to it, any sort of explanation for it. And you also didn't do any storytelling. You did it in the book, but not on the album. And this is great for one specific reason that I see. There's no villainization. He's not villainizing anyone. And just as an example of a story that is trying to save the world, but doing a worse job of it. An example of this to me is the Netflix film that just came out a couple months ago, probably, called Don't Look Up. And it's about the catastrophe of global climate change. And it's sort of a farcical story. It's very funny. It's completely in line with my politics. So I liked it. I enjoyed it. I thought it was very funny. But it neuters itself as messaging and as political messaging and as activism, because it couldn't resist the temptation to make the fools, the villains, the vampires of the story, red hat wearing Republicans, and basically Trump types. And as soon as you do that, the people that you most want to convince that global warming is a real problem are completely turned off. They see the agenda. They
Right.
see that they're being transformed into the despised villain of the story. And they say, oh, this is just more liberal propaganda. So one thing, one thing to avoid is villainizing exactly the people you hope to persuade.
Right. That's the word sway comes early in your new book. And that's not sway at all. You're not swaying anyone with that. You're basically getting the clicks that you know that you'll get because you have that finite number in front of you. You're like, here's the number of people who are going to agree with this, and that's my base. And the base works for getting support, but that doesn't work for getting some kind of consensus and working together towards something. So I think that's a really important part about the agenda, because art shouldn't really, you shouldn't overtly see the agenda. That's for an essay or a speech or something. Art shouldn't be doing that.
I heard one time a very distinguished man whose name, I'm sorry, I just cannot remember at the moment, but he was the ambassador from some of the South Pacific Islands, Solomon Islands. And he spoke at a meeting, and this is in relation to what Jonathan is saying. It was pointing out what the problems that the whaling industry had created and what needed to happen should happen. It was so gently done, so there was nothing. There were no hidden messages, no nasty little digs or any characterizations. It was all as though he was talking to close friends. And it was the single most effective talk I've ever heard anybody give on the subject of whaling. It was simply phenomenal. And it didn't last very long, but it was just amazing.
Yeah, I always argue that if kids aren't going to be artists, and most aren't, that one of the things you learn to do through the arts when you're a kid is to compose something to speak, public speaking or just framing things in general. It's really, it's important. There's an artful and an artistic way. And it sounds like this cat did that. I mean, first of all, it's short. So he went with all killer, no filler, which is a good idea. Didn't bore us, got to the chorus.
All killer, no filler.
Yeah. I mean, what is then, can you think of either of you think of any specific instances in modern times of, it doesn't have to be popular art, but some sort of art that is or has been moving the proverbial needle in some kind of way, or seems to be on the right track to do it? Like, because in music, I really can't. It all kind of goes back to your Netflix example of Don't Look Up. That's what I see. And it's not compelling to me either when it's done that way. And art should be honest. So I don't argue with someone who, if they're pissed off, says, "You're frying the planet, man." I mean, that's the way they feel about it. But it's not gonna move anyone.
I do have an example, and I worry that I might have already used this last time we talked.
That's
but I'll
okay.
give it anyway because it's the best one I can think of. There's been massive change over the last 15 or 20 years in how gay people are treated in America and much of the rest of the Western world. It's been this kind of phenomenal sea change that has been utterly flabbergasting to social scientists. Going from a place, where they're really, gay people are really stigmatized. It was kind of okay to make jokes about them and to slur them. It was a very strong consensus that they shouldn't get married. They shouldn't be able to raise children, and so on and so forth. And over 15, 20 years, it just completely flip-flopped. And to the point where attitudes of tolerance towards homosexuality are very impressive now. And when they look for explanations of this, one of the places that they go, and they give a lot of the credit to, is simple television shows. It's been, in fact, called the Will and Grace effect. And so, and this was the least heavy-handed sort of activism you could imagine. There was not much in the way of speeches on Will and Grace. They didn't have, a bunch of Republicans showing up and beating up gay guys in every episode. All they had to do was much like Roger's whale song, is just show gay people living their lives. Yeah, just show it and show them laughing and show them struggling and show them loving. And before you know it, people are saying, hey, you know what? After all, I actually don't find these guys all that icky. I actually don't find this repulsive morally or otherwise.
Because your best friend now is on television.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we have this sort of, the social scientists call this parasocial interaction. So we form real kind of, they're one way, but we form real social relationships with our favorite TV characters, for instance. And we transfer the attitudes that we have toward them to the class they represent. So we said, yeah, I like Will, I like Jack, I like these gay guys on this show. And so what's cool about this is like the strongest indicator of whether someone is going to have tolerant attitudes towards gay people is whether or not they know one. Do you know one? Do you have a close family member, a close friend who's gay? If so, your attitudes of tolerance are more likely to be high. The cool thing about this, it doesn't matter if the person's real or not. It can be a fake gay friend. Yeah. And if you have a fake gay friend, it seems to have the same, move you in that same direction of tolerance. Yeah. And this is part of a larger scholarship in something called entertainment education. So there's a whole bunch of like TV shows, especially in the developed world, the developing world, where, they're trying to work sort of pro-social messaging into stories in a show don't tell sort of way, but it's very effective. And it seems to be much more effective than explicit messaging by saying, like you just said about singing a song about you're frying the planet, go burn in hell,
Yeah.
I also think it's hugely important to just see people doing completely normal things, not being preached at, but simply being allowed to participate with is the way I'd look at it.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm getting from that as someone who writes is just another reminder of what any editor will say over and over again to you, which is show us, don't tell us. And when it comes to making anything a good song or whatever, it does really seem like that is super important when you're trying to use art to tell a story or for the greater good. And another thing that occurs to me, and this I've just pulled out of the recesses of the back of my brain, but I feel like my daughter came home from college one summer and told me about a class she took in the early days of the CIA and bringing in authors in order to sort of push various agendas that the CIA was trying to push. And she thought of it as, pretty sinister. I think it was being taught as such, and I understand why that would be. But it is kind of interesting, the idea that it would be coordinated. For instance, if I wanted to write something that was going to make any kind of change, I feel like I would need a team of other songwriters and other authors who are all hitting other small points. All that one TV show has to do is have a dignified gay character that's your friend on screen. But then that's it. And then the next song takes that one step further. Because if you try in one song or you try in one piece of art too hard, your agenda steps out in front of the art. People don't trust it and they don't listen to it anymore. Do you know anything about that program, or am I dreaming that up, John?
What program?
It's some kind of program with the CIA.
Oh, no, I don't know the program.
I'm running a podcast. I'm talking about the CIA. Yeah. I don't know what it was called It may have been like Operation Mockingbird or some crap like that. But the idea was that various authors that you knew of, and Gracie came home and told me like 5 names that I knew of, were all in this group. And they were just taking a small, it could be a humanitarian issue to just humanize, put in their work to try to create an environment and a paradigm that we live in that moves us towards a certain way of thinking. You can call it brainwashing if you want, but if we're going to tell a story, we can't do it. Just one artist can't step out on stage or make a movie that does almost anything. It needs to be a larger thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know the program, and I actually made a note of it so I can look it up later because that's very interesting to me. I wish I had known about it.
I'll ask Gracie about it. She's on a boat right now, Roger, getting her sea legs.
But everything you're saying, I think, makes perfect sense. There's basically, the way I think about it, there's basically 2 ways that human beings can communicate. They can rationalize by coming up with arguments and backing it up with evidence, or they can dramatize by telling stories. And the science on this is pretty darn clear that when it comes to just about any outcome that a communicator could conceivably care about, do people pay attention to my story? Do they like it? Do they remember it after it's over? Are they persuaded by it? Do they then amplify my story by retelling it and spreading it through their own social networks? When it just comes back to any of those measures, emotionally drenched storytelling outcompetes, dull rationalization, and does so by a lot. As soon as you become explicit in your messaging, you knock people out of that sort of soft, receptive mode when we're receiving a story, and you knock them into the mode of receiving rational argument, which is a critical and skeptical mental state. So you become much. Now, again, this is all wonderful as long as we believe that storytellers are good guys.
Right.
But the storytellers can also be bad guys. Donald Trump, again, I think he was kind of a bad guy, and he's a hell of a storyteller.
Yeah.
He's a shameless, talented, fabulous, and he tells this incredible story. He creates this incredible alternative universe. Some people call it MAGA world, and it is so invigorating and so powerful and so attractive to so many people that he maroons about half of our country inside this alternative reality. And so it's kind of, I as you know, I have mixed feelings about storytelling being the solution to our problems. When I wrote The Storytelling Animal, I had this line in it somewhere. It's a very common, almost hackneyed sort of line, but it's like, I was thinking of stories as good things, and I was thinking like, here's the question we should be asking: how can we use stories to change the world for the better?
Yeah.
10 years go by, the world changes an awful lot. That brings the negative capacity of story into much sharper relief for me. And I end my introduction of that book by asking a very different question. I say something like, the question we should be asking ourselves today is not the cliched question, how do we save the world through stories? The question we should be asking is, how do we save the world from stories? Because I think it really is the stories and the collision of these stories, all of these, ideological narratives and conspiracy narratives and demagogic narratives and disinformation narratives and propaganda and so on and so forth that are driving the species mad. And I mean that in both senses of the word mad. They're driving us into these fits of intense irrationality. That's one sense. And they're also revving up our rage and our mutual hostility.
Well, and I think the problem when, if you just think of a debate, and it's a political debate, and one side is willing to spin stories, willing to make it up, there's obviously a lot of honor in knowing your place and going, I'm a policy wonk. Here are my reasons, and here's my data, and here's my argument. That's, you have to be willing to just create fiction on some level to be able to fight that, because no matter how much you might make up, there's nothing more interesting than what just comes out of someone's head, you know?
Right.
If they're willing to just completely be fictional about it, then that's a really tough place to be in. I mean, again, I go back to a moment with Roger on our podcast where I was talking about creativity just for creativity's sake, and I'm like, could you give me a little piece or something? Let's make a thing. And Roger said that there's nothing more important right now than art to tell the story, to essentially save human beings from probably not being here in a century or two. And that was really sobering to me because, you know, as an artist and a person, I'm thinking, wow, I got to start getting out there and making some stuff. Roger sent me out into the world to tell the story. But I have to say,
right. Yeah.
it's a very, 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 very difficult a story for a musician. You know, I look out on an audience which is completely divided, and it's touchy. Anything that I touch feels like it's going to trigger an emotional response, that the narrative is so hot and is such in a part of the story for everyone that they're just about to blow. They sing 3-part harmonies that are beautiful at my concerts. I just let them do this thing, and it's the most together I ever feel with people that I don't agree with, and I think that they would probably agree with that. The moment that I come out with an agenda, they're not going to sing those harmonies. So I may try to go out and save the planet, save some whales, even save anybody. But as soon as I start, the agenda part of it, I pokes out and people stop singing together. I figure if I walk into a concert with people who didn't get along, and when I leave, they've sung 3-part harmony together that's absolutely gorgeous, that's kind of all I can do. That's my excuse. But I'm still thinking about what you said.
That's a hell of a lot. That's wonderful.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
It does feel nice, but it also makes me
I've seen
greedy.
you do that on video before. It's amazing.
I have too. Yeah. Wonderful.
People sing so well. And this is a whole other thing, but like what I found about people in large numbers is that you can get a large number of people, most of whom don't have musical training, and their tuning gets better and better the more people there are in the audience.
Really?
It's
one thing
crazy.
I've noticed about this sort of group music making is I am extremely shy about any sort of self-display. Like if I were to dance or if I were to sing, I would be extremely shy and inhibited about it. But if there's enough people around me who are singing and dancing so that my own expression or whatever is engulfed in this larger performance, so I don't stand out in any way, then I can participate. That's I could never sing in public except in a situation like the ones that you orchestrate, and it's only because I disappear into this super organism of this large crowd.
And it's interesting how the organism gets just better, and it could just be because of what you said. It could be just because of inhibitions, that the power of numbers. But there's also something bizarrely correcting about it too. I feel as a musician, what I'm hearing is tuning, which is really complicated stuff. There's tuning on the piano, which is even tempered tuning, but that's a human-made
distinction. Yeah.
Distinction. It's not real. It's just what we decided. But you hear people tuning thirds, and they start coming up to what's more of probably a mathematically correct third than you have on the piano, because they're in the audience, and that's bizarre to me.
We think of storytelling as being this wonderful way of generating empathy. It's how we connect with people across different cultures and races and so forth. You know, we see Will and Grace on the sitcom, and we feel empathy for them. We say, oh, these people aren't that different from us. And all this is true, but storytelling is also, there's this other energy running through stories. And it wouldn't be far wrong to call that energy hate. There's a lot of love in stories, but also a lot of hate. We hate the villain of the story. We hate the bad guy. There's a phrase by a scholar that I like named Fritz Breithaupt, and he's talking about story-based empathy and also the dark side of it. And the phrase is empathetic sadism. And empathetic sadism is this giddy, unwholesome joy we feel when the bad guy of the story is finally captured or humiliated or even killed by the good guy of the story. And we feel virtuous as we revel in the sufferings of the bad guy. And so, one thing that I'm looking for from people as they construct their stories, artists construct their stories, just ordinary people as they construct their narratives that get them through the day, is to strive for a sort of more radical form of empathy. We're used to, trying to empathize with the suffering of the wretched of the earth, the poor, the enchained, the enslaved, the immiserated, and the ethical wisdom of that isn't hard to grasp. It's contained in that phrase there, but for the grace of God go I.
Right.
But when it comes to the bad guys, we have this huge failure of empathetic imagination.
Right,
when it comes to the bad guys of history, the conquistadors, the slavers, the inquisitors, we won't allow ourselves to acknowledge that is where we would have gone to, quite obviously, if not for the grace of God. The devil isn't the other. The devil is us. It's who we would have been if we were born into, exactly their circumstances. And so the thing that is really ineffective, I think, in storytelling, in terms of messaging, there's two things. One is explicit messaging. The other is villainization of the people you're hoping to persuade. So if you have a song about global warming to sing it. But don't say "fuck the Republicans" along the way. You know what I mean?
Let me make a note of that.
Yeah,
that's right. I think that's profoundly interesting. I buy into that very strongly in terms of what I've seen in my long life. That does make a huge difference. I remember when I first got going on whales, and it looked like, oh yes, this is the way to get an interest in whales. I mean, get the world interested in whales. I tried to do the same thing in my imagination with rhinoceros, because I think that the loss of rhinoceros is just a great tragedy. And I realized that I think the success of that would have been, but I ran out of enough energy to be able to do it, to try to show them not as these, mighty, bus-sized creatures crashing through the wilderness, breaking stuff, but in fact show them, unsure in the morning and sort of looking around, somewhat concerned, so that you get the idea of a gentler creature. And when I had that idea, I happened to be going I had a trip that took me to Nepal, and there were rhinos, and we saw a lot of them. And I discovered, my God, that's exactly the way they look. They are unsure. Maybe that's just getting your mind more used to the concept of, oh, well, whatever we've been doing in the past hasn't been working, so let's try this. But I don't think so. I have the impression of an animal of caution and, I don't know, and I'm not so sure about this type of thing.
That's... Well, you'd like to say that humanizes them, but it's not really. We don't have the patent on any emotion, do we? Really? I mean, these are shared by animals all over the world. How many species has the human race eradicated or caused to go extinct?
I can't remember numbers, and if I try to quote one, I'll just embarrass myself and annoy everybody else. But it's a shockingly large number. Of course, the number of species is estimated as high by some people as 10 million. Most people stick closer to something around 1 million. So there's no general agreement as to actually how many species there are. So, but as I recall, guessing from what I had heard, it was something like about a third of species either are gone or on their way out before the end of this century, something like that. It's just shocking. Absolutely.
and science indicates that's because of us.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Science is comfortable with that concept as a good place to look first. Put it that way.
Right.
But
Okay.
it's a there are so many complex causes, and there are so many people fighting so hard to twist the truth as far as they possibly can, and if
Right.
they can
And they're good storytellers.
yeah, they're storytellers.
Yeah.
And yeah.
How long do you think? How long do you personally think we have left on this planet? Our race species.
Oh, well, I would think. I mean, at the present time, without change, a serious change happening, my feeling is I wouldn't give us 500 years. I wouldn't give us 200 years.
Right.
And yet, I think obviously, I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But my feeling is that the only thing that gives me hope, really, that is not, a very much more accurate prediction than you normally hear, is simply that once people decide to change, they change so fast you can't even keep up with it. And
That's right.
the classic
Gay marriage.
example, and the classic example I remember of that is when the Berlin Wall started coming down. Basically, if you listened to all the top leaders, the really knowledgeable people, those with backgrounds and so forth, their commentary at the time came out to be basically, holy smokes, look at that, the wall's coming down. I mean, who knew? It was that kind of complete failure to have really had faith in any sort of prediction that anything would be happening that fast. And you see it in all sorts of other examples. And so once people decide to change and they recognize the importance of doing it and that there is nothing else that's going to work, I think it will happen so fast that, then, hell, I could believe in anything. I would become much more sure that there is a chance. And the exciting thing to me also is that one person, there are people now with so much wealth that one person could save the world, and I wish they would. And let me give you the example that I know. The most effective method of preserving different species that are under terrible threat from some appalling thing that humanity is doing turns out to be, again and again and again, lots of examples, to take somebody and put them out in the field and they start doing studies of the whales or the pangolins or the rhinoceros or anything else, the hummingbirds, if you will, of some area, and they become expert in it. They make friends and contacts with local peoples who live in that area. They get those who were once poaching involved with being paid to be helping to correct the situation, and pretty soon you think, my God, this species might actually make it. And when you get that kind of approach to it, you realize that this sort of approach would mean that suppose you took $1 billion, and most people have no idea how much $1 billion is, and you asked, how many people could you pay $100,000 a year to live out in the boondocks somewhere, doing this sort of work on, how many species could you preserve for that? And if you're paying $100,000 for a year, you could preserve 10,000 species at 100,000, and that's $1 billion. And if you think about it a moment, you and I, all of us, all four of us, cannot name 10,000 species. We can't come anywhere close to it. And so if you looked at the possibility then that one person who has not just $1 billion, but there are a couple of individuals who have over $50 billion, could actually set up something which would have enough funding behind it to do the whole job. And at the same time, they would have to struggle along somehow, living on a mere $2 or $3 billion. And,
that's big ask.
Well, I just feel that somebody could do that, and they would become the most loved human being who's ever lived and perhaps ever will live, it seems to me.
And what I get out of that is the the storytelling side of me, or the side that's interested in stories, is that, the planet might not, or the planet probably be fine. I mean, it's probably the people on it, But let's say we take the bottom figure of your pessimistic projection, and it's 200 years that people last. I mean, you're talking about like the grandchildren of my kids or something like that, seeing the real quick slide into extinction of human beings. And I'm not sure that no one walks around with that kind of perspective. But I left our conversation really spun out about that possibility. Because it's one thing to turn on the television and have someone say something dramatic about it. And it's another thing to have someone that who has spent their life on it, say, no, this is actually a possibility. It's a possibility that your great-grandkids might watch the end of people. But at the same time, this same person is telling me that they know that people can and have often changed so quickly and turned on a dime, and progress has been made at just a breakneck speed, so that both of those things are possible, and it's really up to us.
I knew my grandfather very well. He lived with us for usually about half the year after year after year. And he was born in 1860. That means that he was born 162 years ago. And actually, as a little boy, his mother picked him up so he could see over the edge of a coffin in which there was a dead man, and the dead man was Abraham Lincoln. So that's how quickly you get back. And he had a huge effect on my life. He was a musician and loved playing piano, and I loved hearing him. And so my feeling is it's happening so fast that unless humanity recognizes, and I ain't dead yet, and unless you recognize that, we're just kidding ourselves again and again and again. And I think there's so much happier and better way to live by facing it, dealing with it with everyone else, and making it work.
Well, everyone likes a challenge. That's the thing. Everyone's out working, trying to achieve something. And my argument is always for investment in the arts is arts creates interest, and there's nothing more powerful than interest. If someone's interested in something, they'll buy it, they'll spend their time on it, they'll chase it around the earth. And we have to be interested in that. And I think the science of narratology anyway, and of getting the story right is got to be hugely important. And we're novices at that. Either of y'all have anything to add to my final farewell podcast? I'm really honored that you both make the time to talk to a musician about these things. I appreciate it.
Well, we both respect musicians. We respect you too, Ben. Don't forget it.
Yes. I have nothing to add except that thank you for having me on. I'm very honored too to be with you and to be with Roger. This has been really cool talking to you the two times we've done so.
And that's a great treat for me. My God, that was just thrilling. Yeah.
Well, thanks, guys. And keep up the good work.
Same to you, Ben.
All right. Hi, if you're enjoying listening to Lightning Bugs, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. It helps a lot. Thank you so much for watching Lightning Bugs on YouTube. Check out more episodes and subscribe if you have not already. You can also listen to Lightning Bugs wherever podcasts may be found.